Hey guys, and welcome to the first ever segment of the series I'm going to be calling Chit Tuesday. For those of you who don't get the name, just think a little harder. It's not that complicated, I think at least. Didn't take too much time to think, and I think it's quite catchy. I really do. That's why I named it. If you guys want to change the name, you can tell me what you want to change it to, and I'll consider it for sure. For those of you who do get the name though, if you guys want to be cool, want to help those who don't get the name, you can post it down in the comments so other people can, get in the joke as well. So, the basic concept of this series would be that I'll sit in front of a camera, try to explain the basics of a specific theory, normally related to communication, because that's my major. And it'll be strictly opinion based, but keep in mind or be aware that my opinions are somewhat heavily influenced by the actual theory, because I'm studying it. But feel free to correct me, maybe lead me in the direction of another theory I may not be aware of. I'm still a student. And let's get started with today's topic, I guess. You guys are free to suggest any topics if you want down below. If not, I have a list of a few things to talk, I'll be posting these on Tuesdays. So once a week. Well, today's concept, or what we're going to be talking about, is pretty basic in general. It's what is communication and why do we communicate? So, the first thing to have in mind is that we're always communicating. It's part of our basic nature. It's part of our day-to-day routine, our mundane lives. We can communicate at work, if you guys work, I don't know. We communicate at school, with our friends, with our teachers, with our parents and our family members. We communicate even with our dogs, our cats, our fish. You guys can have basically any animal. But you never sit down, or at least I don't think most people sit down and start thinking like, hey, what actually is communication? Or why do we communicate? Because for most people it's kind of like an obvious answer, or at least that's what it would seem at first thought, Like someone tells you, hey, do you know what communication is? And your answer would be like, yeah, I guess I do. I mean, we do it all the time. So your answer in those situations might be, communication is the ability to convey a message. And we communicate to convey a message. It's pretty much that simple. But now, communication, of course, since it turned into a scientific theory and all blah, 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 all those things, it's quite a complicated concept. It has a bunch of parts we actually never analyze on our day-to-day life. A bunch of theories, different perspectives from where to watch it from, where to analyze it from. Of course, like any other scientific theory, it's compromised of different paradigms. So there's actually a lot of things to think about, a lot of things to study in communication. It's quite a broad subject. So today we're going to be analyzing briefly different areas of communication where it can manifest, and the main components of a specific theory that's suggested in the communication process. So, one of the most important things you can keep in mind is that communication is a process of relationship. And this relationship is quite complex. Normally, it would involve more than one individual, but that's debatable. I think communication can actually happen on its own, with just one individual. But for sakes of simplicity, let's say it's more than one individual. One of the most basic theories I would suppose you guys know, it's mostly seen in school. When you study communication, maybe you study it in language section, you would probably hear that communication is a relationship between a sender and a receiver. And in fact, it kind of is. That's the most basic communication process that people study. It's one of the first communication processes that was actually put on paper, you know? So basically, there's a sender and a receiver. Sender emits the message, the receiver receives the message, and then they could possibly switch roles, or the communication process just ends there. But communication is quite a bit more complex. A lot of theories have built upon this simple process and added a bunch of other elements, and even changed the element of the sender and the receiver. So, if you're studying communication, or if you ever get to read communication, you would most probably see that it's not just a sender and a receiver, but that sender is actually also a receiver, and the receiver is actually also a sender. But not in different times, like the basic process would suggest. It actually happens simultaneously. So I'll put this in a sort of dynamic example to see if you can understand me better. Say I'm trying to explain this theory to a friend of mine, and I have him standing right in front of me. And I say, hey, you know, this theory, blah, 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 blah. And when I'm talking and explaining this theory, I'm the sender. I'm emitting the message. But I'm also watching him. I'm watching his facial expressions. I'm watching how his eye moves, his mouth, his face, everything of his body. And that's communicating something to me. So that message that he's transmitting makes him also be a sender. So he's a receiver because he's trying to receive my message, at least. And he's a sender because he's sending what we would call feedback. And feedback is an important concept we're going to build upon later in this video. And I'm receiving that feedback, which is transmitting me a message, and that converts me into a receiver as well, which makes the whole process a lot more complex than it may seem at a first glance. And to build upon that, I even may change my message, or the way I'm transmitting my message, based on this feedback. So that's the complexity of the communication process. Of course, there's a bunch of other elements that come into play. It's not just the two people or the two groups that are, transmitting a message between them. There's also, for example, how I'm transmitting this message, in which form. And the main difference here is channel and source, which are two very important concepts in the communication process as well. So, let's say, for example, I'll try to differentiate. I'll try to make a difference or mark a clear difference between channel and source, because these two concepts quite normally are used in very similar situations. And actually that's kind of correct, because they go hand in hand. There's no channel without a source, and no source without a channel. But I'll put it like this. Channel would be, in general, the more generic idea of the way I'm transmitting a message. Say, for example, internet, that would be a channel. Written, that can also be a channel. Or body movements, that can also be a channel. But the source is different. The source is a bit more specific. You can say it's kind of inside the generic channel. You could say that. It would be technically correct. And for example, if the channel is internet, then the source could be a blog, it could be a web post, it could be a social media post. There are different types of ways to transmit a message inside the same channel. If you say, for example, the channel is written, then the source could be, for example, a book. It could be a magazine, it could be a voucher. You would use different communication techniques to transmit a message through these different sources inside the same channel. So I hope that's clear. That's kind of important. Because let's say, for example, I don't know, you're trying to get a traveler's attention, transmit the basic ideas you need to visit a specific country. Yes, you could write a book about a country and explain in detail everything that happens in that country. But for a traveler, it would probably be a lot more attractive, generally speaking, if you hand them a pamphlet or a voucher explaining like crucial tips. It's different ways to put the same message. Okay. Now we get into, for example, the different areas where communication can manifest itself. Of course, as I've said at the beginning of this video, communication is present everywhere. And since it's present everywhere, then it's extremely complex and it manifests itself in various different forms. Of course, there's the mundane communication, when you talk to a friend. Maybe when you talk to a colleague, you can call that mundane. Or when you talk to a family member, different situations where you interact, maybe in your daily life. But that when communication is turned formal and professional, then that's where it manifests differently. It's not the same, for example, communication inside journalism. Not the same communication you use when you're talking about advertising, marketing. Different forms of communication manifest differently. Uses different resources. For example, institutional communication. If you don't know what that is, I'll briefly explain it, but we might talk about it in a different video. But basically, the main concept of institutional communication is that the communicator, which is the person who works professionally in the area of communication, works to unite everyone inside an institution, and at the same time works to relate this institution with the outside world. That's like general concept. It's much more complex than that. Well, you would be using different types of communication. I would reckon that different disciplines can come inside the communication process as well. For example, let's say, if you're trying to sell a product, or let's not say sell, let's say if we're trying to put a product or a brand inside the mentality of a specific audience, well, we'd be talking about advertising and marketing, right? Okay. We would be using, for example, photography, because images are quite common in advertising and marketing campaigns. We would be using graphic designs. We could be using audiovisual productions as well, quite common. But let's say you're a journalist. You're producing news for media. You would also be using graphic design. You would also be using photography, but not in the same way. In journalism, you could probably say that photography and graphic designs are used to add on to the information of the news, while in advertising and marketing, you're not adding on, you're actually making it the main element. You're basically enhancing the product through photography or through graphic design. So, while in advertising and marketing you can edit a photography, in journalism you normally wouldn't, because it's considered unethical. So there you can see how communication manifests itself in different areas, how it interacts with different disciplines, and how different areas use the same disciplines but in different manners. And I think that's quite fascinating, You would have to have at least a vague idea of these different disciplines if you're going to be an excellent communicator. Now, I want to touch up on this last concept that I think it's quite important for any communication process. And I would go as far to say as it's the crucial element. And that's context. Context is actually one of the most important elements in any communication process. And you would be surprised that not everyone actually talks about context when they're talking about communication. It sounds kind of weird, but basically context is placing something in a specific space at a specific time. And that, of course, heavily influences how you're going to transmit a message and through what means you're going to transmit a message. So, for example, let's take back that example that I said near the beginning of the video or near the middle of the video, where I mentioned you're trying to communicate the essential essences of a country to a traveler. Let's say that traveler is going to Japan. You would name stuff related to Japan. If that traveler is going to Australia, you would name stuff related to Australia. That's kind of obvious, of course. So that's the most obvious example of how context, the situation, marks the content of the message, essentially. You're not going to say the same thing if the context isn't the same. Now, taking into account the aspect of time, it's not the same, for example, if you're talking to a traveler who in 2019 is going to Japan, or if this traveler is going to Japan and it's the year, I don't know, let's say 2005. Pretty sure Japan changed a lot in that decade, at least. So the content of the message would also shift. Some things would be more important, maybe. Some things would be less important in 2005. Not sure. Some things might not even exist. There might be elements to not take into account. These are a bunch of variables that communicators have to know, or at least try to know, to make a successful communication, of course. Now, a different example. Pretty different, actually. Let's say I have two friends, and one likes video games, and one is a movie enthusiast. Let's say I want to play a video game. The obvious answer, if I want to play with someone, would be to ask the guy that likes playing video games, But it's actually different how you say, hey, let's play a video game. So I could tell him, hey, tomorrow let's play a video game at said hour, say 8 o'clock. Or I could say, hey, I found this really cool game. How about we play tomorrow? Or I could say, tomorrow, video game 8. Different ways of transmitting the same message. If you get to know this person, you supposedly know them because they're your friend, you can know how to transmit this message to make it more appealing to them. It kind of sounds like manipulation, and that's because it is actually manipulation. Communication is basically manipulating the reality or the reality of the message you're trying to transmit. You're trying to make it more appealing so the communication process is successful. Now, a bit more complex of an example. I still have my two friends, but let's say my friend that plays video games isn't available, and I still want to play video games with someone. And let's say I'm lucky enough that the video game I want to play is actually based on the movie enthusiast's favorite movie. If I want to make him play this video game with me, and I know that he doesn't really enjoy video games in general, then if I straight out tell him, hey, do you want to play a video game? He'd probably say no, let's be honest. But if I go up to him and I say, hey dude, I found this game, and I know you don't like games, but it's based on your favorite movie, so I suppose you would enjoy it. It's actually quite probable that he might say yes. Of course, he could say no, but he might say yes. So that's an example of manipulating a message to make it seem more appealing to the target audience, to the other person I'm trying to convey this message. So, rounding things up, I think one of the most important things you have to take into account when communicating is that you have to try to enhance the message you're transmitting to make it appealing to this other person. And one of the other things that's actually quite crucial is that communication isn't an exact science. You're not going to have always the same variables. You're never going to have the same variables. You're never going to have the same context, the same channel, the same source. It's never going to align specifically in the same situations, So it could be extremely similar, but there's always going to be variables that you're not able to take into account. And what you have to take from this as that even if you have this situation and this other situation that are extremely similar, and you do the same process, one of them might succeed, one of them might not. So communication is basically a game of chance. Sometimes the chances are actually really high that they have the same outcome, but there's always that possibility of not succeeding in the communicating process. So always keep that in mind when communicating. Of course, you're never going to actually use this in your day-to-day life. I mean, you might every now and then, but if you try to analyze all this, basically every communication you have, I think that would be stupid. I think that would be going way too far. Just flat out communicate like you do. Try to trust your instinct when communicating. If you know this person, you know what they like, then it's kind of pretty easy to make a message more appealing to them. So keep that in mind. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was helpful in some way. If you have any kind of doubts, leave them in the comments. I have a blog. I'll post it down in the description. I post about these things in a more formal and organized fashion. By the time you're seeing this video, probably there'll be at least 3 posts, but all 3 of them would be actually related to this video, because I try to make the posts a little bit smaller or easier to read, you know, not like I don't know how long this video will be, let's say around 15 minutes. The posts, you can read them about 3 minutes, so they're quite an easy read. I recommend you do it if you're interested in the topics. If you have another topic you want me to talk about, then also post it down below. You can contact me on my social media. Feel free to DM me, no stress. And I hope you have a wonderful week, wonderful day. I recommend my other videos, of course, and you're welcome to subscribe. Love you all.